He seeks to tear us apart for his own gain. I will fight to protect my baby.
Counsel approach the bench.
There are moments in life when a single room can hold more tension than an entire lifetime of success. And in one of the most expensive courtrooms in New York, a billionaire was laughing like he had already won everything. Not because he was right, but because he believed nothing could touch him anymore. His lawyers smiled with him. His friends leaned back like spectators at a show they had already seen the ending of. And across from him, the woman he once promised forever to sat completely still, as if she had already accepted defeat. But then the judge asked for the final confirmation. And that's when she stood up. No warning, no emotion, just one sentence that made the entire room go silent. Before you sign those papers, there's something you need to see. The doors opened slowly behind her, and she walked back into the courtroom holding a newborn baby. In that exact moment, the billionaire's smile didn't fade slowly. It disappeared completely, like it had never existed. And what happened next would turn a routine divorce into a case that no one in that room would ever forget. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We genuinely read every single comment, and it helps us see how far these stories are reaching. And if you're not already part of this community, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next cinematic story. Because what you're about to hear next is only the beginning of what really happened in that courtroom. There are moments in life when everything a person has built, every deal, every connection, every dollar, stops meaning anything in a single breath. And inside a packed New York courtroom, a billionaire sat smiling like he had already won a war no one else could afford to fight. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the people who were there would later describe the same thing: arrogance disguised as certainty. His lawyers whispered to each other like men reviewing a case already closed. His closest advisors nodded quietly, convinced this was just a formality before the final signature. And across the aisle sat Claire Walker, the woman the world had already decided had lost everything. No headlines favored her. No analysts believed she had leverage. Even silence in that room seemed to lean toward Ethan Walker. Then the judge looked up and asked for final confirmation. That was supposed to be the end of it. But Claire Walker stood up, slowly, calmly, and when she spoke, her voice did not shake. Before you sign those papers, there's something you need to see. No one understood what she meant, until the courtroom doors opened behind her, and she walked back in holding a newborn baby. The reaction wasn't gradual. It was immediate, the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but heavy. Ethan Walker didn't laugh anymore. He didn't move. He didn't blink for a moment that felt too long to be natural. Because in that instant, something inside his control began to slip. And what nobody in that courtroom knew yet was that this moment was not the beginning of a surprise. It was the end of a secret that had been waiting years to surface. Inside a New York courtroom packed with legal teams, financial advisors, and silent witnesses, Ethan Walker sat like a man who had already calculated the outcome. At 56, he was not just wealthy. He was influential enough that people adjusted their expectations before he even spoke. And today, he believed there was nothing left to challenge. His attorneys reviewed final documents with calm confidence. Every detail of the case had been prepared, structured, and reinforced weeks in advance. To them, this was not a battle. It was a confirmation. Across the room, Claire Walker sat alone. No entourage, no visible support, just stillness. For most people watching, she looked outmatched. Even observers who had followed the case expected the same outcome. Ethan Walker had built companies, reshaped industries, and outmaneuvered rivals for decades. A divorce case, even a high-profile one, was not supposed to disturb that pattern. The judge adjusted the final papers and asked the question that would normally end everything. Do both parties confirm the terms as presented? Ethan leaned back slightly. A faint smile returned to his face. And then he laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because he believed the outcome was already guaranteed. A few members of his team followed quietly. The sound filled the room in a way that felt final. Then Claire Walker stood up. The laughter stopped. She looked directly at the judge and said calmly, "Before you sign those papers, there's something you need to see." No one moved at first. Then the courtroom doors slowly opened behind her, and she walked back in holding a newborn baby. The shift in the room was immediate. Silence replaced certainty. Ethan Walker's expression collapsed into something unfamiliar, something unplanned. Because in that moment, everyone realized the case had just changed direction, without warning, without explanation, and without permission. For a few seconds after the baby appeared, the courtroom did not respond like a normal room would. There was no immediate questioning, no interruption, no movement toward understanding. Instead, there was a kind of suspended disbelief, as if reality itself had paused to confirm what everyone had just seen. Ethan Walker did not speak. That detail mattered more than anything else. Because in every previous hearing, every negotiation, every financial dispute he had ever faced, Ethan Walker always spoke first. He controlled the tone. He controlled the direction. He controlled the pressure in the room. But now, for the first time, he had nothing to say that could restore order to the moment. Claire Walker remained standing in near the center aisle, holding the newborn with steady arms. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the reporters. She did not look at anyone except the judge, as though the rest of the room had already been accounted for. The judge finally broke the silence. "Mrs. Walker, you will need to explain what is being presented to this court." But Claire did not respond immediately. Instead, she took one slow step forward. And that single step changed the energy in the room again. Because it suggested intention, not confusion, not emotion, but preparation. Ethan's attorney leaned toward him, whispering urgently, asking something that could not be heard clearly from the gallery. Ethan did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the child, not in recognition, but in calculation, as if his mind was trying to locate where this moment fit inside a structure that had already been finalized. Claire finally spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the court to hear. "I didn't bring this here to interrupt the proceedings." A pause. "I brought this here because the proceedings were already built on something incomplete." That word landed differently than everything before it. Incomplete, because it did not accuse anyone directly, but it suggested that what everyone believed to be final might not have been fully true. A court officer shifted slightly near the doors. A reporter lowered their pen. Even the judge seemed to reconsider the sequence of what was unfolding. Ethan finally looked away from the child and toward Claire. Not with anger. Not yet. But with something closer to concern. Because incomplete, in a courtroom like this, did not remain a simple statement for long. It became a question that spread into everything else. Documents, assumptions, timelines, agreements. And once that kind of question enters a case involving billions of dollars, it does not stay contained. The judge requested clarification again, this time more firmly. "State your purpose here, Mrs. Walker. What exactly is this child's relevance to these proceedings?" Claire looked down briefly at the newborn, then back up, and what she said next did not answer the question directly. It widened it. "This is not a disruption." Another pause. "This is something that was never included in the record." At that moment, Ethan's expression changed for the first time since the hearing began. Not fully, not dramatically, but enough for the people closest to him to notice. Because never included in the record was not emotional language. It was legal language. And legal language in a room like this meant only one thing. Something had been left out, or something had been hidden. The judge leaned forward slightly. The atmosphere in the courtroom tightened again, not from volume, but from attention. Everyone was now listening more carefully than before, because the story they thought they were watching had shifted into a different category entirely. Claire did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply added one final line before the next phase began. "You cannot divide what was built on an incomplete understanding." And in that moment, Ethan Walker realized something subtle but irreversible. This was no longer just about divorce proceedings continuing. It was about whether the foundation of those proceedings could still be trusted at all. Before the private jets, before the boardrooms, before the headlines that called Ethan Walker one of the most powerful men in American business, there was a different version of him that almost no one remembers anymore. He was not surrounded by advisors. He was not backed by investors. He was not confident in the way people later came to recognize. He was a man working late nights in a cramped apartment just outside Chicago, building something that most people believed would fail before it ever became real. And the only person who stayed through every version of that uncertainty was Claire Walker. Back then, Claire was not introduced as the billionaire's wife. She was introduced as the person who answered phones when no one else would. The person who organized documents when Ethan's ideas were still too early to be taken seriously. The person who kept things moving when money ran out and hope became the only resource left. She was there when the first prototype failed. She was there when investors refused to return calls. She was there when Ethan questioned whether he should walk away from everything entirely. And in those early years, Ethan did something that would later become difficult to reconcile with the man he turned into. He listened to her. Not occasionally, not selectively, but fully. Because in that version of their lives, Claire was not standing behind him. She was building beside him. And for a long time, that partnership worked because survival required it. But survival has a way of changing when it becomes success. The first shift was subtle. Ethan started traveling more. At first, it was meetings in other states. Then it became conferences. Then international deals that required longer absences. Each time he left, he returned with more confidence, more authority, and less of the uncertainty that once defined him. Claire noticed the change before she ever spoke about it. Because change in people like Ethan does not arrive loudly. It arrives through absence. A missed dinner. A shorter conversation. A phone call that ends before anything meaningful is said. And slowly, what once felt like partnership began to feel like coordination. Not connection, just management. As Ethan's company expanded into what would eventually become Walker Global Holdings, the world began to see him differently. Media profiles called him a visionary. Investors called him a genius. Analysts called him inevitable. But inside the private world of the Walker marriage, something far less visible was taking shape. Distance. Not physical at first. Emotional. Claire would later describe it as the feeling of speaking to someone who was still familiar in appearance, but increasingly unfamiliar in response. Conversations that once lasted hours were replaced with updates. Shared decisions were replaced with notifications. Shared dreams were replaced with individual obligations. And then came the part that Claire never forgot. The silence that followed questions she used to be able to ask freely. At first, she thought it was stress. Then she thought it was success. Then she began to understand something more uncomfortable. Some changes are not accidental. Some changes are structured. Around the time Walker Global Holdings crossed its first billion-dollar valuation, Claire began noticing inconsistencies she could not easily explain. Financial movements that were technically legitimate but intentionally opaque. Corporate restructuring steps that she was not consulted on. Advisory decisions that bypassed her entirely. When she asked Ethan about it, the answers were always calm, always controlled, always temporary. Just legal restructuring, just efficiency adjustments, just standard expansion protocols. But the pattern was consistent enough that it stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like exclusion. Still, Claire did not confront him immediately, not because she lacked evidence, but because she remembered who they had been before everything changed. And that memory made the truth harder to accept. Instead, she began observing. Quietly, carefully, not as a wife reacting to suspicion, but as someone beginning to understand that systems do not change without intention behind them. Then came the moment that shifted everything completely. Late one evening, while reviewing documents left open in Ethan's private office, Claire found a set of financial and legal structures that did not match anything she had ever been shown before. They were not illegal on their surface. They were more sophisticated than that. They were exclusionary, designed in layers, built in ways that determined who had access to what information and who did not. Her name was absent from key decision pathways. Her authority had been gradually reduced in areas she had once actively managed. And most importantly, the structure did not appear to be recent. It appeared to have been developing over time, quietly, systematically. That was the moment Claire stopped interpreting the changes as emotional distance and started interpreting them as preparation. Preparation for what? She did not yet know. But she understood one thing clearly. Nothing at that level of structure happens without intent. And somewhere inside the empire Ethan Walker was building, Claire Walker was no longer being treated as a participant in the future. She was being treated as a variable that could be removed. And that realization did not break her. It focused her. Because once you understand that you are being written out of something slowly, you stop asking to stay in it and start preparing for what happens when it finally ends. The shift inside the Walker marriage did not happen in a single argument. It did not happen in a dramatic confrontation or a final spoken accusation. It happened in smaller moments that, at the time, seemed almost insignificant, but later formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Claire Walker began to notice something she had never experienced before in their relationship. Decisions being made without her. Not debated, not discussed, already finalized. It started with financial summaries that arrived later than usual. Then it became reports that were partially redacted. Then it became entire categories of information that were no longer included in her access at all. When she asked questions, Ethan did not react with anger. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, he reacted with calm certainty, as if the structure itself had already decided what she did and did not need to know. "You don't need to worry about that anymore," he would say. Or, "It's already handled." Or sometimes, simply silence. And silence, Claire would later realize, was not absence. It was direction. Because nothing at Ethan Walker's level happened without intention. At the same time, Ethan's world was expanding faster than ever. Walker Global Holdings entered new markets, acquired smaller firms, and consolidated influence in ways that attracted national attention. To the outside world, he was entering his peak. To those inside the system, everything appeared streamlined, efficient, unstoppable. But inside the marriage, efficiency had a cost. Claire was no longer part of the conversations that shaped their future. She was being informed after the future had already been shaped. Then came the moment that changed her perspective entirely. One evening, while reviewing documents that were still accessible to her, Claire noticed a structural shift in ownership pathways she had never seen before. At first glance, it appeared like standard corporate optimization. But the deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Control was being centralized. Decision authority was being narrowed. Access was being redistributed in ways that quietly reduced her influence without removing her name entirely. It was not a single action. It was a sequence. And sequences are harder to notice than events. That night, Claire did not confront Ethan. She did something different. She began copying. Not emotionally, not impulsively, but methodically. Every document she was still allowed to see. Every communication she had access to. Every structural detail that hinted at how the empire was being reorganized. Because at that point, Claire was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She was trying to preserve evidence of it. Meanwhile, Ethan remained unchanged in public perception. Interviews continued. Deals expanded. Media profiles grew more favorable. He spoke about discipline, vision, and sacrifice, often emphasizing that success required difficult decisions. But no one asked who those decisions were affecting. And inside the Walker home, those decisions were already reshaping everything. Then, without warning, Claire encountered something she was not supposed to see at all. A sealed internal financial structure labeled under an external advisory classification that did not match any known operational division she had previously worked with. It referenced contingencies. It referenced separation pathways. And most importantly, it referenced asset continuity under conditions that assumed a future without shared spousal integration. Claire read it more than once. Not because it was unclear, but because it was clear enough to be unsettling. This was not a reaction to a marriage breaking down. This was preparation for a marriage already considered structurally irrelevant. And that was the moment everything became irreversible in her mind. Not because she decided to leave, but because she understood she was already being positioned for removal. And from that point forward, Claire Walker stopped seeing herself as part of the system she had helped build. She began operating outside of it. Quietly, carefully, not to react, but to prepare. Because now, the question was no longer whether something was changing inside the Walker empire. The question was how long it had been changing before anyone noticed. Claire Walker did not leave the Walker estate immediately. She did not announce her intentions. She did not confront Ethan Walker with accusations or demands. Instead, she began doing something far more calculated. She started asking questions to people who were not supposed to know she was asking questions. At first, it was subtle. A conversation with a former colleague from Ethan's early startup days. A brief meeting with a financial analyst who had once worked on Walker Global Holdings expansion modeling. A consultation with a legal specialist outside of Ethan's corporate network. Nothing official, nothing traceable through the usual channels, but enough to begin forming a clearer picture of what she had already begun to suspect. What Claire learned was not a single act of wrongdoing. It was something more complex than that. It was structure, layers of financial design built over time, each one reinforcing the next, each one reducing visibility while increasing control. And the most important realization was this: the system did not need to break rules to become one-sided. It only needed to define access. Meanwhile, Ethan remained publicly unchanged. His schedule continued as normal. Meetings, acquisitions, interviews, appearances that reinforced the image of stability and control. To the outside world, nothing was shifting. But inside Claire's private reality, everything was beginning to reframe. She was no longer asking, "What is happening?" She was asking, "How long has this already been in motion?" That question changed the direction of everything she did next. Claire began systematically preserving information, not emotional records, not personal reflections, but structured documentation, financial summaries, legal correspondence, access logs, corporate filings that showed how decision pathways had been altered over time. She was not collecting this out of anger. She was collecting it because she understood something critical. In systems built at Ethan Walker's level, memory is not enough. Evidence is everything. And even then, evidence must be organized in a way that can survive interpretation. During this time, Claire also discovered something unexpected. Certain structural decisions inside Walker Global Holdings referenced long-term contingency planning that did not align with any known external pressure or market requirement. These structures were not reactive. They were anticipatory, which meant they were built with foresight. And foresight always implies intent. The more she studied it, the clearer it became that her exclusion was not a sudden decision. It was a gradual integration into a system that had already defined her reduced role long before she was aware of it. But Claire did not rush. She did not panic. Instead, she built slowly, carefully, because she now understood something Ethan Walker had underestimated. The most dangerous moment in any controlled system is not when someone reacts. It is when someone begins preparing without being detected. And while Ethan continued to operate under the assumption that all significant variables were already accounted for, Claire Walker was quietly building something that did not yet have a name inside his system. A response, not emotional, not impulsive, structured, deliberate, and patient enough to wait until the exact moment it would matter most. Back in the courtroom timeline, the baby had already changed the direction of the case. But outside of it, something far more significant was forming. Because Claire Walker was no longer trying to prove what had happened. She was preparing to show what had been built around it. And that distinction would soon become the difference between assumption and consequence. The second major hearing did not begin with confidence on either side. It began with restraint. Even the people who had come expecting a straightforward continuation of proceedings now sensed that the case had moved into unfamiliar territory. Ethan Walker entered the courtroom differently this time, not with arrogance, but with focus. His legal team stayed closer than before, exchanging fewer words, watching more carefully. Whatever certainty had existed in the early stages of this case had been replaced by calculation. Claire Walker arrived shortly after, still calm, still controlled. And once again, she carried the newborn. But this time, no one reacted with shock, because shock had already passed. What remained was attention. Every movement in the room tracked her presence more closely than before. The baby was no longer treated as an interruption. It was now treated as a factor that needed explanation. The judge opened the session with a noticeably different tone. All parties are reminded that this court requires clarity on the new submissions and their relevance to the estate structure and pending division. Ethan's attorney stood first, attempting to restore procedural control. He argued that while the documents submitted in the previous hearing were being reviewed, there was still no confirmed legal relevance that altered the core structure of the case. But even as he spoke, the confidence in his delivery was thinner than before, because the problem was no longer whether the documents existed. The problem was what they implied. Claire's attorney then requested permission to formally submit additional verification material. Permission was granted. What followed was not dramatic. It was systematic. Documents were presented in sequence: medical records, certified agreements, historical filings connected to early-stage fertility consultations during the Walker marriage. None of it was speculative. All of it was documented. And slowly, the narrative inside the courtroom began to shift from financial dispute to biological and legal classification. Ethan leaned forward as each page was reviewed, not because he was surprised by every detail, but because he was trying to determine which part of the structure had failed to prevent this moment from occurring. Then came the document that changed the tone completely. A court-certified genetic confirmation linking the newborn to Ethan Walker under previously established reproductive material agreements from the earlier years of the marriage. The room did not react loudly. It reacted slowly, because understanding did not arrive instantly. It arrived in layers. First recognition, then implication, then consequence. Ethan's voice broke through for the first time since the session began. This was never presented to me in this context. Claire did not respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone remained steady. It was never hidden. A pause. It was just never prioritized. That distinction shifted the atmosphere again, because it moved the conversation away from accusation and into interpretation of responsibility. The judge called for a temporary pause in proceedings to review the newly verified material in full detail. But even as the session was paused, something irreversible had already occurred. The baby was no longer just present in the room. It had become central to the legal framework of the case. And for the first time, Ethan Walker was no longer looking at the situation as a controlled dispute. He was looking at it as something that could expand beyond his original assumptions. Because once lineage enters a legal structure at this level, it does not remain isolated. It spreads into ownership, into inheritance, into everything built on the assumption of absence. And what had once been a divorce case was now becoming something far larger than anyone in that courtroom had originally prepared for. The temporary pause in proceedings did not bring relief. It brought pressure, the kind of pressure that builds in silence, when no one is speaking, but everyone is thinking faster than they can control. Outside the courtroom, reporters tried to piece together fragments of what had been revealed, but the story refused to fit into any simple headline. Inside, lawyers on both sides were no longer debating outcomes. They were reevaluating foundations. Ethan Walker remained seated longer than anyone expected after the recess was announced. He did not leave immediately with his team. Instead, he stayed still, reviewing documents again, not because he had not read them, but because repetition sometimes feels like control when certainty begins to fade. Claire Walker had already left the immediate center of attention, but she was not disengaged. She was observing everything quietly, including something many people overlooked. The way Ethan was no longer interrupting silence. The way his legal team was no longer speaking in absolutes. The way questions were beginning to replace statements. These were not emotional signals. They were structural ones. When the court reconvened briefly to confirm procedural next steps, the language had already shifted. The judge now referred to verification of lineage-related submissions and review of estate-impacting biological evidence. Terms that would have sounded irrelevant days earlier now carried weight that affected the entire trajectory of the case. Ethan's attorney requested clarification on whether the new documents would affect asset division timelines. The judge did not answer directly. Instead, he stated that until full validation was complete, no assumptions about the estate structure could be considered final. That sentence changed everything. Because in legal environments like this, not final does not mean unchanged. It means unstable. And instability at this level does not remain contained for long. As proceedings adjourned for the day, Ethan finally stood to leave. Cameras outside the courthouse captured his exit, but for the first time in his public life, he did not acknowledge them. There was no wave, no pause, no controlled expression designed for interpretation. Just movement. Direct. Silent. Claire exited moments later, still holding the newborn. But what made this moment different was not the presence of the child. It was the absence of shock from those watching. The story was no longer reacting. It was evolving. And somewhere beneath the legal arguments, financial structures, and biological confirmations, a deeper realization was forming across both legal teams. This case was no longer about proving who was right. It was about understanding how much of what they believed had already been decided long before the first hearing ever began. And once that kind of doubt enters a structured system, it does not leave cleanly. It spreads into every assumption that followed it, even the ones no one thought to question. By the next morning, the Walker case was no longer being discussed as a divorce proceeding in legal circles. It had become something else entirely, an unfolding dispute that now touched questions of lineage, estate structure, and long-term corporate governance. Inside Walker Global Holdings, internal meetings were called without public announcement. Advisors who had once treated the situation as a private family matter were now speaking in terms of risk exposure and structural uncertainty. Nothing had changed officially, but everything was being reevaluated. Ethan Walker arrived at the courthouse earlier than before. This time, there was no trace of public performance in his movement. No composed smile. No rehearsed calm. He walked directly inside with his legal team, avoiding the cameras waiting outside as though they no longer belonged to his world. Claire arrived later. And again, she carried the child. But now, something subtle had changed in the way people looked at her. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition that whatever she represented was now embedded in the case itself. When the hearing began, the judge addressed the court with a tone that reflected the weight of what had developed. This matter now includes submissions that require full structural review before any determinations regarding asset division or estate interpretation can proceed. The phrasing was careful, but the implication was not. Ethan's attorney attempted to reassert procedural boundaries, arguing that the core financial structure of the estate should remain separate from ongoing biological verification processes. But even as the argument was made, it lacked the certainty it once carried. Because separation only works when categories remain distinct. And in this case, they were no longer distinct. Claire's legal team then introduced a final consolidated submission. Not new evidence, but synthesis. A structured presentation connecting earlier financial arrangements, historical reproductive agreements, and estate assumptions that had been built over time. What emerged was not a single revelation. It was a pattern, and patterns are more difficult to dismiss than isolated claims. Ethan reviewed the documents slowly, page by page, not because he did not understand them, but because understanding them meant accepting that the structure he had relied on for years had contained assumptions he no longer fully controlled. Then the final confirmation was stated aloud in court for the record. A verified legal recognition of biological connection under previously executed agreements that had not been fully accounted for in prior estate declarations. The room did not react dramatically. It did not need to, because the impact was not emotional anymore. It was procedural, and procedural changes at this level do not stay confined to one case. They move outward, into ownership structures, into governance models, into everything built upon the original assumptions now being questioned. Ethan finally spoke again, quietly. This changes nothing that wasn't already accounted for. But even he did not sound fully convinced. Claire did not respond. She simply looked at the judge, because she no longer needed to argue the point. The structure itself was now under review. And once a structure reaches that stage, it is no longer held together by confidence. It is held together only by verification. And verification takes time. Time that neither side could fully control anymore. The final adjournment came without ceremony. No dramatic ruling. No final verdict. No declaration of victory for either side. Just a procedural closure that carried far more weight than anything spoken earlier in the day. The judge confirmed what everyone in the room already understood. The case could not move forward to final determination until every layer of documentation, financial, biological, and structural, had been independently verified and reconciled within the legal framework of the estate. In simpler terms, nothing was settled, and everything was now open. Ethan Walker stood slowly, adjusting his jacket in a way that looked habitual, not confident. For the first time since the proceedings began, he did not immediately engage with his legal team. He did not speak. He did not direct. He simply moved, as though recalibrating himself to a reality that no longer responded to his usual level of control. Claire Walker remained seated for a moment longer. The newborn rested quietly in her arms, unaffected by the weight of the room around it. When she finally stood, she did so without looking at Ethan, not out of avoidance, but because the confrontation was no longer the point. The structure itself had already changed. As Claire exited the courtroom, the atmosphere outside was louder than before. Reporters calling questions, cameras shifting, voices overlapping in attempts to capture meaning from something still unfolding. But none of it fully matched what had actually occurred inside. Because inside that courtroom, nothing had ended. It had only transitioned. From certainty to examination. From assumption to verification. From control to uncertainty. Ethan stepped out moments later, no longer acknowledging the cameras as he once did. The image of him that had defined public perception for years did not appear. Instead, what remained was something more restrained, less defined, still powerful, but no longer absolute. And that distinction mattered more than anything else that had happened that day, because empires are not only shaped by what they control, they are shaped by what they must now prove. And for the first time in Ethan Walker's life, the burden of proof no longer sat with others. It sat with him. Claire walked away without looking back, not because the story had ended, but because it had already moved beyond the point where looking back could change anything. And in cases like this, the real outcome is never what is announced in court. It is what begins to unfold after everyone leaves the room. And with that, the story comes to a close, not with a verdict carved in stone, but with questions that linger long after the courtroom doors have shut. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments are not the ones where everything is decided, but the ones that force everyone to reconsider what they thought they already knew. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with the story all the way through. I truly hope you felt every moment, every shift, and every silence along the way. If you enjoyed this narrative, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more cinematic true-to-life stories, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what you think really changed everything in that courtroom. Your engagement helps bring more stories like this to life. Until the next story, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.